I gripped my beer, staring at the condensation dripping down the glass, my mind still struggling to process everything. The bar was dimly lit, half empty, the kind of place where guys like me sat in silence, trying to drink away the worst moments of their lives. Across from me, my best friend Jim sat with his own beer, untouched. He had no idea what was coming. "You called me here in the middle of the damn day," Jim finally said, frowning. "What's going on?" I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "Man, I don't even know where to start." Jim leaned forward. "Start from the beginning." I let out a bitter chuckle. "That's the problem. I don't even know when the beginning was." For over 20 years, I had been married to Carol. We had built a life together, bought a house, raised kids, survived the usual ups and downs. But lately, things had felt different, cold, distant, like we were just two people sharing a space instead of a life. Every night, I lay in bed next to her, but it was like she was miles away. No talking, no touching, nothing. I had tried. Everything. Date nights, gifts, even bringing up counseling. But Carol wasn't interested. She brushed me off, said she was just tired, stressed. But I knew it was more than that. So I made a plan. "I booked a surprise weekend for us," I told Jim, staring at my beer. "A nice resort, candlelit dinners, spa treatments, the whole damn thing. I even bought her favorite perfume, picked out a dress I knew she'd love." I scoffed. "Thought maybe if we got away, we could find our way back to each other." Jim gave a small nod. "Sounds like you put a lot into it." "Yeah," I muttered. And that's what makes what happened next even worse. I got off work early, excited to surprise her. I packed our bags, made sure everything was perfect. I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when I told her. But the second I walked through the front door, something felt off. The house was quiet, except for one thing. I heard it. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Soft moans. The kind no husband ever wants to hear in his own home. I froze, my heart slamming in my chest. My brain refused to believe it. Maybe the TV was on. Maybe I was misunderstanding. Maybe. Then I heard a man's voice, and I knew. Jim's expression darkened. "You went inside, didn't you?" I nodded slowly, my jaw clenched. "Yeah, I stepped inside that damn room." The second I pushed the door open, everything stopped. The bed was a mess, sheets tangled, the air thick with something I didn't want to acknowledge. A woman, half covered in those same sheets, her breathing heavy, her body still tense from whatever the hell had just happened. Her hair was wild, her eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. And next to her, a man, bare-chested, his hair damp with sweat, his face frozen in pure panic. They weren't expecting me. They thought they had more time. The man scrambled, reaching for his clothes, while the woman clutched the sheets tighter around herself. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. My eyes were locked on him. "Dan," I said, my voice eerily calm. Jim's brow furrowed. "Dan? Wait, Dan from next door?" I let out a slow breath, gripping my bottle so tight I thought it might shatter. "Yeah, that Dan." Jim cursed under his breath, shaking his head. "Jesus Christ. In my house, Jim. In my bed." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I stood there just staring. I don't even know how long. Everything felt frozen. Then Dan finally found his voice. "Ken, man, listen." I mimicked his panicked tone, my lip curling in disgust. Like I was going to sit there and listen to whatever bullshit excuse he had. Jim shifted in his seat, looking more and more uncomfortable. "What did you do?" I glanced up at him, my grip tightening around the bottle. I grabbed my gun. Jim stiffened. "What?" "You heard me." I leaned back, my voice flat. "I grabbed my damn gun." "Jesus, Ken." "Relax," I muttered. It wasn't loaded. Jim exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. "Still, man, you could have—" "I wanted to," I admitted. "For a second, I really did. but I didn't need to. You should have seen their faces when I pointed it at them. Dan went pale, like ghost white. The woman! She screamed, scrambling back like I was about to actually pull the trigger. Jim shook his head, his fingers tapping restlessly against the counter. So what happened? I told them to get the hell out. I let out a slow, shaky breath, remembering how my voice had barely sounded like my own. I stood there, watching them scramble, grabbing their clothes, tripping over each other like a couple of idiots. Dan kept stammering some nonsense, but I wasn't hearing it. I just wanted them gone. I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling exhaustion settle into my bones. And then they were, just like that. They ran out, barely dressed, humiliated, and I stood there, alone, in the ruins of my life. Jim was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. And Carol? I let out a bitter laugh. Didn't even go looking for her. I grabbed my keys, walked out, and came straight here. Jim nodded slowly, processing everything. But something about his expression had changed. He looked tense, unsettled. What? I asked. He hesitated. Then, Dan, and who? I blinked. Vicky. The second I said her name, Jim's entire body went still. I watched his face closely, saw the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally forced out, "You're saying my wife was in your bed?" The air between us shifted, something heavy pressing down on both of us. Jim's breathing slowed, his fingers curled into a fist, his face drained of all color. I didn't need to say anything else. He knew. He knew. It was true. And in an instant, Jim pushed back his chair, grabbed his keys, and stormed out of the bar. I watched as Jim stormed out of the bar, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't even say another word to me. Didn't look back. Just grabbed his keys and left, moving like a man possessed. I let out a slow breath, running a hand down my face. I had just dropped a nuclear bomb on his life, the same way mine had. Been obliterated just hours ago. Should I have softened the blow? Maybe. But what was the point? The truth was the truth. And now Jim was about to walk into his own nightmare. I stared at my beer, the condensation running down the sides, untouched. My stomach churned. Everything about this day felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart, not my own. The bartender gave me a wary glance, like he was debating whether to cut me off. I shook my head. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't even close. Alcohol wasn't going to fix this. Nothing would. My phone buzzed on the counter. Carol. I let it ring. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. Instead, I exhaled sharply and signaled for another drink. Meanwhile, Jim drove like a bat out of hell, his mind racing faster than the car speeding down the road. His breathing was heavy, erratic, every heartbeat slamming against his ribs. Vicky, Vicky, Vicky. He could still hear my voice saying her name. Could still see the dead look in my eyes when I told him what I had walked in on. His wife. His wife. In my bed. With Dan. He gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from losing it completely. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick mistake, a misunderstanding. Vicky wouldn't do this. Not to him. Not like this. But I wouldn't lie. I had no reason to. He pulled into his driveway, tires screeching against the pavement. The house stood in front of him, looking exactly the same as it always had, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He shoved the car door open and stormed inside. "Vicky!" His voice thundered through the house, shaking the walls. Silence. Then, footsteps. A moment later, she appeared at the top of the stairs, her face twisted in confusion. "Jim? What the hell? Shut up!" His voice was sharp, cracking with something raw. "Don't. Just don't." Vicky's brows furrowed, but something flickered in her eyes, not just confusion. fear. Jim, you're scaring me. He let out a hollow laugh. Scaring you? That's rich. Were you scared when you were screwing Dan in Ken's bed? He watched the color drain from her face. Her lips parted slightly, like she was about to deny it, but she didn't, because she couldn't. Jim. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't say a word. His whole body was trembling. He wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything to make this pain stop, but nothing could fix this. Nothing. Vicky took a step forward, hands up like she was approaching a wild animal. Jim, please, just let me explain. Explain? His laugh was humorless. Explain what exactly? How long, Vicky? How long have you been sneaking around behind my back? Her lip quivered. She looked away. Jim, how long? The silence stretched. When she finally spoke, it shattered him. A year. A full year. 12 months of lies, of betrayal, of going to bed next to a woman who had already chosen someone else. Jim felt something inside him snap. He turned on his heel and walked straight to their bedroom, yanking open the closet and pulling out a suitcase. What are you doing? Vicky's voice was panicked now, shaking. What the hell do you think I'm doing? Jim threw the suitcase onto the bed and started grabbing clothes, shoving them inside without a second thought. His mind was blank, running purely on rage and instinct. Jim, stop! Let's talk about this. Talk? He turned to her, his face twisted in disgust. You weren't interested in talking when you were in Ken's house, were you? It wasn't like that. Don't lie to me. His voice cracked, raw and broken. You don't get to do that. Not anymore. Vicky's eyes welled up with tears. Jim, I love you. He froze. Then, slowly, he turned to her. You love me? His voice was barely a whisper. You love me, but you spent a year with another man? You love me, but you let Ken find out before I did? You love me? Vicky sobbed. I made a mistake? No, Jim cut her off. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is leaving the stove on. This was a choice. Over and over and over again. He zipped up the suitcase and grabbed it, brushing past her without another word. Jim, please! She grabbed his arm, but he ripped himself away, his voice cold and final. Don't follow me. Then he walked out, and he didn't look back. Meanwhile, I was still at the bar, staring at my phone. 3 missed calls from Carol. 1 text. We need to talk. I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair. Yeah, we did. But I wasn't sure if I was ready for whatever she had to say. I sat in my truck outside the house, gripping the steering. Wheels so hard my knuckles turned white. The engine hummed softly, the only sound breaking the silence of the night. My phone sat on the dashboard, the screen lighting up with another call from Carol. I stared at it, my jaw clenched. I still hadn't answered her, not since I walked out of our house and straight to the bar. Not since I told Jim the truth. Not since everything fell apart. I wasn't ready, but I couldn't sit out here forever. Eventually, I killed the engine, grabbed my keys, and stepped out. The house was dark except for the faint glow coming from the living room. I could see Carol sitting on the couch through the window, her posture rigid, her hands clenched together in her lap. She had been waiting. I walked in without a word, didn't take off my shoes, didn't shrug off my jacket, just stood there, staring at her, waiting for her to speak first. Carol looked up at me, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something between guilt and defiance. You know, she said quietly. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh yeah, I know. I expected her to deny it, to cry, to beg for forgiveness, but she didn't. Instead, she just sat there watching me, her fingers digging into her palms. I never slept with Dan, she finally said. I scoffed, shaking my head. Well, congratulations. Want a medal? Carol flinched but didn't look away. I knew. That made me pause. My breath caught in my throat. What? Carol swallowed hard, her voice trembling now. I knew about them. Vicky and Dan. I knew, and I let it happen. Silence filled. The room, heavier than anything I had felt all night. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process what she was saying. My hands started to shake. You let them use our house? My voice was low, dangerous. Carol closed her eyes. It wasn't like that. Don't! I snapped, stepping closer. Don't you dare tell me it wasn't like that. My chest was heaving now, rage boiling just beneath the surface. How long, Carol? How long did you let them turn our house into their goddamn motel? She wiped at her eyes, but the tears barely made me flinch. A few months, she whispered. They came when you were at work. Vicky said they had nowhere else to go. You let them do it here? My voice cracked, something breaking inside of me. I turned away, hands on my head, pacing the room like a caged animal. I could handle a lot of things, but this was beyond betrayal. It was like she had watched someone rob us blind and decided to hold the door open. I thought if I let them, Carol said, her voice barely above a whisper, Vicky would owe me. She'd keep my secret. I stopped. Slowly, I turned to face her. What secret? Carol's lip quivered. What? Secret? Carol looked away. She couldn't even look me in the eye when she finally muttered, I was thinking about leaving. It was like a punch to the gut. I staggered back a step, as if the words had physically knocked the air out of me. You were... I let out a hollow laugh, running a hand through my hair. Jesus Christ, Carol! I haven't been happy, she admitted, her voice shaking. Neither have you. You know that. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. So, instead of telling me you let your best friend screw another man in our house, that was your solution? Carol shook her head, her face crumbling. I didn't know what to do. I thought... You thought? I cut her off, my voice sharp. You thought what, Carol? That I'd never find out? That it wouldn't destroy me? That it wouldn't rip Jim's life apart? She covered her mouth, muffling a sob. I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I stared at her, my hands trembling. The weight of everything crushed me all at once. The love we had, the years we had built together. It was all ashes now. There was no coming back from this. I can't do this, I muttered, turning toward the stairs. Ken, please. Carol choked out. We can fix this. I paused at the bottom step, shaking my head. No, we can't. I walked upstairs, leaving her sobbing in the living room. The days that followed were suffocating. Jim had kicked Vicky out. Dan had gotten his ass beaten in a bar fight, probably by someone who found out what he had done. Carol barely spoke, staying out of my way, but the silence between us was worse than the screaming. It was over. We just hadn't said the words yet. Then one night, Carol stood at our bedroom door, watching as I packed a suitcase. Are you leaving? Her voice was hollow. I didn't stop folding my shirts. No. I zipped the suitcase and set it by the door. You are. Carol's breath hitched. Ken, if you want to leave, I'll hold the door open for you. I stepped aside, the front door wide open. Carol stared at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. But she didn't move. She didn't run. She just stood there, looking at the man she had broken beyond repair. The door stayed open. Carol stayed. But nothing between us would ever be the same again.